Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a really intense 911 call. It's from a podcast called The Final Call. Um, Basically, this podcast, it covers these really intense emergency calls, and this one in particular features a dispatcher who finds himself in a crazy situation when his own daughter ends up involved in a domestic dispute.
Yeah, it's one of those situations that starts off seemingly normal, right? Frantic guy calling in. You can hear the chaos and fear in his voice when he tells the dispatcher that he's shot someone.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And the dispatcher, real pro that he is, immediately jumps into action, tries to calm the guy down, right? Asking the important questions, who, what, where. But even in those first few seconds, you can hear that little change in his tone, like he knows this is more than just some sort of accident.
It's almost like, these dispatchers, they develop this sixth sense. From handling so many calls, they start picking up on those subtle clues that hint something bigger, something more complex going on.
Right. And that complexity starts to unravel as the caller explains what happened from his perspective. He talks about being denied access to his child, how he just wanted to see his, and I quote, baby for a second. You can just hear that desperation in his voice, that feeling of being wronged.
Yeah. And that feeling of being wronged is, such a common thread in these types of disputes. And it could, turn into anger, resentment, and sometimes violence.
Exactly. And here it seems like that trigger was a simple act, a door being slammed in his face. He describes knocking on the door, asking to see his daughter, and the woman who answers, probably the child's mother, just shuts the door on him.
It's crazy how such a seemingly small act, that rejection, can become a catalyst for something so much bigger. I mean, we don't know the caller's full backstory, but you can just hear how deeply this denial impacted him.
It's scary. It's a reminder of how quickly things can get out of control, right? How a seemingly minor incident can spiral into something so much darker.
Absolutely. And that darkness continues as the caller reveals that there's a woman and a child with him. Right away, the dispatcher changes his approach, tries to figure out if they're safe. It's this careful dance of getting information and trying to negotiate the situation. But what he doesn't know yet is that this is about to hit incredibly close to home.
This is where everything changes. It comes out that the woman on the other end of the line is the dispatcher's own daughter, Madeline, and the caller is probably Greg, her partner.
Can you imagine the dispatcher's mindset in that moment? He has to balance his job, his duty, with this overwhelming fear and concern for his own daughter. He's stuck in this impossible situation, having to be both the detached professional and the terrified father. Talk about a psychological tightrope walk.
It's hard to wrap your head around what must have been going through his mind. And you can hear that emotional shift in the transcript. He goes from calm and collected to using terms of endearment like honey when he's talking to Madeline. It's not about procedure anymore. It's about trying to save his daughter.
And, him breaking protocol like that just shows the intense emotional strain he must have been under. It really highlights what makes this call so disturbing and so unique. The dispatcher isn't just listening in, he's thrown right into the middle of this horrifying situation.
And then comes the worst part, the sound of gunshots.
Yeah, and you could hear Madeline crying out and the dispatcher desperately asking for information, followed by this horrible silence.
I can't even imagine the helplessness he must have felt, knowing his daughter was in danger and not being able to do anything.
A lot of dispatchers describe this feeling, being a detached observer to these traumatic events. But in this case, it's amplified because of that personal connection.
Then Greg comes back on the line, but this time he calls the dispatcher Dad. It's chilling.
The betrayal is so clear. Not only has Greg committed this horrible act, but he's destroyed the trust, the family bond that was there. And he does it knowing the dispatcher's listening, unable to do anything.
Devastating. Then Greg confesses to killing Madeline and the child. He just says flatly, if I couldn't have them, then no one can. Just a cold display of possessiveness and rage.
It's a chilling confession. Brings us face to face with the horrifying reality of domestic violence.
Definitely a stark reminder of the dark side of human behavior and the tragic consequences that can unfold.
And it underlines the importance of understanding just how complicated these situations are. Often there's a history there, a buildup of abuse, mental health struggles, or other factors that lead to these tragedies.
It's not about making excuses for these actions, but it's about understanding that these situations are rarely straightforward.
Exactly. And it really emphasizes the need for us to be more aware, more preventative measures, support systems to help individuals and families before things escalate to this point.
So we've set the scene for this incredibly intense 911 call. You've heard the desperation, the fear, and the tragic outcome. And this is really just the beginning of our dive into this case.
In the next part, we're going to go deeper into the psychological impacts of this call, especially on the dispatcher. We'll explore the broader issues around domestic violence and the challenges faced by those on the front lines of emergency response.
We'll be back after a short break. So we're back, and I think we all have to be thinking about the dispatcher right now. I mean, hearing those gunshots, knowing it was his own daughter, that's got to be a level of trauma that most of us can't even begin to imagine.
Absolutely. And this is where we really have to consider the human cost of emergency response. These dispatchers are constantly exposed to trauma. Hearing those cries for help, the panic, the raw emotions of people in crisis. But in this case, it's not just some stranger, it's family.
Yeah, that's got to create a whole other level of emotional turmoil, right? Trying to do your job, stay professional, but also you're a father who's just witnessed this horrific thing happen to his child. How do you even process that?
That's a question a lot of researchers are trying to answer. Studies are showing that 911 dispatchers actually have higher rates of PTSD, anxiety, and depression than the general population. That constant exposure to trauma, it takes a toll. And when you add in a personal connection like this, the impact is even greater.
So what kind of support systems are out there for these first responders? Like, we know police officers and firefighters, they often have debriefings, counseling, peer support groups. Do dispatchers have access to those same resources?
Well, unfortunately, the support systems for dispatchers, they're also not as developed. It's a field that's been historically undervalued and under-resourced. But thankfully, that's starting to change as more people become aware of the unique challenges they face.
So what needs to change? What can be done to better support these people who are literally on the front lines of these crises?
Well, for starters, mandatory mental health resources are crucial. Regular counseling sessions, access to peer support groups where they can share their experiences and learn coping mechanisms, even training in trauma-informed care. Those things would make a huge difference.
That makes sense. I mean, you wouldn't send a firefighter into a burning building without the right gear, so why would you expect dispatchers to handle these intense, emotionally charged situations without the proper support and tools to process them?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that their mental well-being is just as important as their physical safety.
Yes.
And it's not just about preventing burnout or compassion fatigue. It's about making sure that they can do their jobs effectively.
Right, because if a dispatcher is struggling emotionally, they might not be as sharp, as focused, as quick to respond. And in these emergency situations, those seconds can be critical.
Absolutely. Investing in dispatcher mental health isn't just about compassion. It's about public safety.
This call also brings up the bigger issue of domestic violence. And sadly, it's all too common. It's easy to get caught up in the shock and horror of this specific incident, but we can't forget that this pattern repeats itself in countless homes every day.
This case is a really stark reminder that domestic violence isn't just about physical abuse. It's about control manipulation, power imbalances within a relationship. Greg's actions, his desperation to see his child, the slammed door, the escalation to violence, it all points to this larger societal problem that we need to address.
So where do we even start to tackle a problem as complex and as deeply rooted as domestic violence?
It starts with awareness. Recognizing the signs, understanding the dynamics, breaking the stigma surrounding it. Then we need to focus on prevention. Early intervention programs, educating people about healthy relationships, providing resources for families in crisis. These can all make a real difference.
So it sounds like a multifaceted approach is key here. It's not just about punishing the abuser. It's about providing support for the victims, promoting healthy relationship models, and addressing those underlying societal factors that contribute to these cycles of violence.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the role of law enforcement and the legal system. Are there enough resources dedicated to investigating these cases? Are restraining orders being enforced effectively? Are victims being provided with adequate protection and support?
Those are really important questions. This isn't just about responding to these incidents after they happen. It's about creating a system that's actively working to prevent them.
Exactly. And this is where the conversation needs to move beyond this particular case and towards a more comprehensive understanding of the issue.
Okay, so we've looked at the emotional toll on the dispatcher, and we've explored some of the complexities of domestic violence. But there's another aspect to this story that we need to unpack: the lasting impact of trauma.
Right. Trauma doesn't just go away. It affects not only the people directly involved, but also their families, their friends, their communities.
In the last part of our deep dive, we'll explore those long-term consequences, and we'll examine the potential for healing and growth in the aftermath of tragedy.
We'll also look at the role of storytelling and how podcasts like The Final Call can be used to raise awareness, challenge our perceptions, and ultimately inspire positive change.
So we're back, and now we have to think about what happens after a call like this. The trauma spreads outward.
Yeah, it really is like that, like the stone dropped into a pond. The first impact is devastating, but then the waves keep going right, and they affect everyone. In this case, you have the dispatcher, his family, the first responders who had to go to the scene. They all carry this tragedy with them.
And it makes you think about the dispatcher in this story. I mean, how does he even go back to work? How does he answer those calls knowing what he's been through? How do you separate your job from something so personal?
It's really a testament to how resilient people are, that so many of them find ways to cope and keep helping people. But it's not easy. Some turn to things like substance abuse, or they isolate themselves. Others struggle with their mental health.
Yeah.
It's really hard to process the emotional weight of experiences like this.
That brings us back to how important long-term mental health support is for these first responders. It's not just about dealing with the immediate crisis, it's about giving them the resources and care to help them heal over the long term.
Right, and healing looks different for everybody. Some people find help in therapy, others in peer support groups. Some people find it in creative outlets like writing or art. It's about finding what works for you, what helps you make sense of things, and feel like you have some peace and control again.
And this call also reminds us that we need to recognize the signs of trauma in ourselves and the people around us. It's not always obvious or dramatic. Sometimes it's just someone withdrawing from people, a change in their sleep, or maybe a sudden outburst of anger.
It's so important to be able to see those signs.
Yeah.
It lets us offer support and encourage people to get help, and it creates a space of understanding and compassion.
And that leads us back to the power of storytelling. Podcasts like The Final Call, even though they're tough to listen to, they have a really important role to play.
Yeah.
They shed light on these experiences that are often hidden or misunderstood. And that helps people understand and have empathy.
They help us see the real people behind the statistics and the headlines. And by doing that, they challenge us to face those uncomfortable realities, to have tough conversations, and to push for change.
And this specific call with that personal connection, it's even more powerful. It makes us realize that tragedy can happen to anyone, anywhere, and that the impact of trauma goes way beyond the immediate victims.
But even with all that darkness, there's still hope. The podcast ends with a message of support, telling listeners to reach out for help if they're struggling. It reminds us that we're not alone in these experiences. There are resources out there, people who care, and a way to heal.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what do you hope our listeners take away from our conversation? What's that one thing you want them to keep thinking about?
I think the biggest takeaway is just understanding that trauma is complicated. It affects a lot of people, and we can't always see it. But it's also something that we can learn from, heal from, and grow from. It's a call to be more aware, more compassionate, and more supportive of those who are struggling, whether they show it or not.
I love that. This deep dive has really taken us into the depths of human experience, hasn't it? The darkness, the resilience, and the power of hope. It reminds us that even when faced with tragedy, there's always a chance for healing, growth, and connection. And sometimes all it takes is one story, one call for help to start a ripple of change that can reach far beyond ourselves. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we encourage you to keep exploring these important issues and to have conversations that promote understanding, empathy, and positive change.